Today's another read along, and I'm doing Bringing in the May, which is obviously a May Day story. And I wrote this for my blog a couple years ago. It's a short story. It's kind of a longer one, so we're going to do it in 3 parts. And in this book, there is a sweet little old English lady. I do a deplorable British accent, but I'm going to try. And if it just is really, really bad, then I'll quit and just spare you. But I'm going to try because she really should have one, but because not British. Now, if there was a British person in here and I was just chatting, we'd have no problem. But all by my lonesome, not so much. So I don't have a physical copy because it's a short story. So meet the laptop and we're going to read. So Bringing in the May. And funny story, the opening sentence on this thing is one sentence, and it's like 4 almost full lines. And I thought, the editor in me is saying, this has got to get broken up. And the writer in me is going, but I like it just the way it is. So I feel like a total hypocrite as I read this really crazy long sentence. I have a drink in case I get desperately thirsty, so hopefully I won't. Seated in the cozy living room with its overstuffed sofas and chairs, hand-crocheted doilies on every surface, bowls and vases of blooms from the garden atop those doilies, and books tucked into every nook and cranny available, Elton Sadler crossed a bony ankle over an equally knobby knee and leaned back, his head slung in interlaced hands behind it, listening. If the room didn't have the hazy glow of nostalgia, the charming accoutrements of yesteryear, and the air of prim propriety, Elton only needed to close his eyes and listen to the gentle undulation of a woman who not only sounded like the very embodiment of Agatha Christie's Miss Marple, but looked it as well. Went to public school, of course, thanks to a wealthy aunt whom no one in the family liked. Mary Margaret Montmorency, no one ever said one of her names without the other two, gave him an indulgent smile. Now in England, you understand, public schools are those schools which you Yanks would call private schools. I remember my father explaining once, private schools are also technically private by our standards, right? Just so. Mary Margaret Montmorency took a sip of tea and gave him an impish smile before adding, we English would call your public schools a state school. And this aunt of yours, she paid for your school, a boarding school? That faraway look that sometimes overcame her appeared. Mary Margaret Montmorency smiled after a moment of reflection. Yes, Wheaton Abbey. Such a wonderful place, such memories. Again, she hesitated, lost in days long past, before she continued. Oh, we had such times. It was near the village of Wheaton, in Lancashire, of course. Aunt Mary sent me there, thinking it was a strict school that would keep me properly regulated. But we had a lovely headmistress who provided with as much a home-like existence as one can in an institutional setting. Home-like and institutional don't sound like they belong in the same compliment. Elton sputtered between snickers. Are you sure you've not put on your rosy spectacles? The prim lips pursed into a gentle but obvious look of disapproval. I recall with perfect clarity, young man. Of course, he hastened to add. Elton shifted, leaning forward and resting his forearms on the knobs he called knees, hands clasped before him now. How did she do that? We had our own gardens, you see, little plots where we grew vegetables and flowers, just as we might at home. As if it explained everything, the woman who had herself made his own childhood a series of special delights told about her headmistress. Mrs. Summercliff married a German refugee after the war, you know. She wasn't married long, however. Terrible things that had happened to him made him sickly, and he died by 1950. But during her married years, as she hoped for a family of her own, she studied everything she could on educating children. To Elton, the aside meant nothing. What did it have to do with the kinds of things the woman had done to make little Mary Margaret Montmorency feel like her school was a home away from home when libraries were stuffed with stories of horrid schools full of cruel teachers? He didn't ask again, however. No one in his right mind would. The Triple M, as he sometimes thought of her, would answer in her own good time. She discovered Charlotte Mason's work just a couple of years before Mr. Summercliffe died, and had made it a passion of hers. So she went into education, spent years becoming highly sought after, and eventually became headmistress, where she could finally have leeway to attempt her own ideas. He didn't care about nature walks and gardens, about libraries full of wonderful books, and someone always in one of the common rooms reading aloud to a group of girls of all ages. Elton wanted to know about how she made the place feel like home, but couldn't argue that the Triple M thought she was telling that story. And the parties! Oh, how she loved her celebrations. A birthday, a remembrance, Christmas, St. George's Day, bonfire night. A twinkle in her eye made Elton lean forward just a bit more. And even lesser holidays, like the one for tomorrow. All it took was a hand sliding into his pocket and a glance at his phone to take him from uncertain to confused. What's May 1st? We called it Bringing in the May back then. We'd have a lovely maypole with ribbons and the Queen of the May. Mary Margaret Montmorency's voice grew soft, and a delicate pink dusted her cheeks. They crowned me Queen of the May the year I was 12. Oh, I was so proud to wear my white dress and yellow sash with a wreath of daisies in my hair. As picturesque as it sounded, Elton didn't see the fun in skipping around a great pole and wrapping ribbons around it. Seems a little Greenaway-like to me. I suppose, she agreed. That is much how it might seem to a modern observer. As children, it was terribly exciting. We worked for weeks making the pole, learning the dances, choosing who would be the queen, making our May baskets. Here, Elton perked up. And what is a May basket? The Triple M didn't answer. She stood, replaced their tea things on the tray, and carried it to the kitchen. But as he expected, a moment later she returned and pulled a rather large, black, bulky photograph album from the shelf. Let's see, it's in here somewhere. Seated beside him, her little cardigan pulled close around her shoulders, the woman seemed a lot more frail than he remembered from his last visit. Visit her often, Elton. She's my dearest friend, his mother had said. And when I'm gone, she'll be completely alone but for you. He kept his word that he would, for a time. But the last quarter of high school had been busy. Summer had gone well, but going off to college, university, the Triple M called it, that had made visiting harder. And the less frequently he visited, the easier it became to forget her. But since he had moved home to Hillsdale, Elton had made it his goal. Once a fortnight, at the very least. For Mom, and for her sake too, he'd promised himself. He'd kept that promise too, for 3 years now. Oh, here it is. She pointed to a rather plain girl wearing an enormous wreath of daisies, and with the most awkward, self-conscious smile he'd ever seen. She giggled, positively giggled. I know how dreadful I look, Elton. I was always so stiff in front of a camera until Bertie Wheaton told me, don't look at the lens, Mary Margaret. Look at the person behind the lens and try to make him comfortable. A sigh escaped. It worked, too. Elton couldn't let that go. She began to turn the page, but he stopped her. Wait, he called you Mary Margaret? Just Mary Margaret? No Montmorency? I was Mary Margaret St. John back then, before I married Charles Montmorency. He nearly snickered at her oh-so-British pronunciation of St. John for St. John. But they still called you Mary Margaret, not just Mary, Polly, Peg? Certainly not. After he drew back, unable to hide his surprise at the outburst, the Triple M softened her tone. I apologize, Elton. You see, I was named for Aunt Mary, so she would provide my education, of course, and for my mother. I couldn't go by just Margaret or Maggie without raising Aunt Mary's ire. I refused to be called just Mary, like her, and by consequence I became Mary Margaret, and so I am to this day. Her finger traced the edges of the photograph of her as Queen of the May, while he considered her story. It wasn't part of that day's tale, but Elton couldn't help but ask, and when did you become only Mary Margaret Montmorency? I've never heard you spoken of as anything else. The day I married Gerald, of course. He introduced me to everyone in those first weeks after we moved to Surrey. And this is my wife, he'd say, Mary Margaret Montmorency. It just became how people addressed me. First by way of teasing, you understand, but after a time it was just my name. He had so many questions, so many. Why had her aunt been so despised? And why had her parents really named her after the despised aunt just to ensure the girl's education would be funded? It seemed impossible. And what had brought her and Gerald to America? But those questions could wait for another day. She had another story to finish. Well, you could just call me Mary, I suppose. To him, the offer spoke of her great love for him, but he couldn't do it. It would feel disrespectful, and you know Mom would get a special dispensation from the Lord to return and spank me for that one. Something in her wilted a little, and Elton rushed to revive it again. However, I should confess that sometimes I call you the Triple M. At the nickname, he dropped his voice to a deep, ominous tone best suited for movies from the 50s. It took a minute before he caught her meaning. Yes, just like that. Her voice softened a bit, grew wavery as she murmured, It's the closest thing I've ever heard to Mum or Mother. It'll kill me, but I've got to do it now. Mom would insist. I can do that. Now, tell me about bringing in the May. And she did. The hours making cone baskets out of thick paper and ribbons knotted at the sides for handles. It all seemed so silly to him until she turned the page and showed one hanging from a doorknob. That was the headmistress's basket. It was the first one we hung every year. She'd be waiting there, possibly for hours. With the marble floors and her heart-sewed shoes, she could hear us coming before we got off the stairs. But that year I was determined. I made every girl take off her shoes and go down in stockinged feet. Smart! I knew you were a sharp one. Despite her pshawing him, the pink returned to her cheeks. It was one of my cleverer tricks. It would have worked, too, had all of the girls used the sunscreen I gave them. Half of them tried to run back upstairs, only to be caught when they came back down. Precisely. He had to ask. Yes, there would be a good explanation, but he couldn't get it if he didn't ask. And how did you deliver the rest? We had brought them down to the kitchen earlier. Half of those girls got kisses that day, an improvement from nearly all of us in previous years, but still. Kisses? Improvement? She flipped the page once, twice. On the third page, she pointed to a blurred picture of a little boy of about 4 kissing her cheek. He caught me. That little scout must have been hiding in his mother's garden for hours, waiting for someone to come along. But he caught me, fair and square. Again, Elton echoed her. Caught you? She tucked the photograph album between her and the side of the couch before turning to explain. Hands folded in her lap in that pose that always signaled her desire to gesture, something she'd learned not to do at that school. That he'd learned years ago. It worked like this. Recall that For the week or so leading up to May Day, we'd spend hours with thick paper and bits of ribbon and lace in the paste pot. We'd fill the bottom with sweeties, things that wouldn't spoil. Then, the night before or on May Day morning, we'd rise early and cut flowers from the gardens to fill our baskets. He hung his fingers in the air and made quotes with them. Baskets? Exactly. They wouldn't hold much, not for long. But as long as we didn't make them too heavy and people were home when we delivered them, it worked well. You would take the basket and hang it on someone's door, you see. Mary Margaret Montmorency gave a half sigh before sitting upright and pulling herself back out of her memories and into the present again. Must be nice for the recipient. Oh, it is. It's terribly exciting to hear the bell ring or a knock, and once you've hung it, you see, you ring the bell and run. Run? Why? Her hands wrung and rubbed over and over as if working lotion into them. Well, if the person inside opens the door and sees you, she nearly quivered with excitement just telling him about it. We didn't expect our elderly to chase us, you see, but for a younger person, if he or she catches you, that person would kiss you. Oh, really? Interesting. I imagine it was a popular thing with the teenagers then? Not particularly. It was a little too complicated for the younger sweethearts. If a girl was caught, the pink returned once more. Well, that's rather imprudent of her. But if a boy was caught, if he couldn't beat a girl in a foot race, well, then. Even as she spoke, Elton shook his head. They thought about it all wrong. Those girls should have let themselves be caught. The guys, too. If they liked each other, that is. Or maybe. An idea germinated. Maybe? Elton wrapped one of her hands in both of his, and held it. I just thought it might have been a nice way to tell a girl what you thought of her. It's too bad people don't do that here. Oh, but they did. It was very popular in America, from what I'm told. But it died out in the 70s, like so many other traditions did. He heard the regret in her voice. However, despite it registering, his mind was already occupied with other thoughts. It's just too bad. I wish people would revive some of the old things like that. They're lovely customs, to be sure. Sanding is all but a lost art, but May baskets, why would we want to give up those? We've kept mistletoe and Christmas crackers. Where do we go? As much as he wanted to ask what she meant by sanding, Elton decided not to ask. Not this time. He'd miss his nightly chance to say hi to his neighbor if he didn't hurry home to walk his dog. You'll have to tell me about sanding next time, and who knows, maybe I can convince the youth group to try May baskets next year, for the seniors at least. Stood and put away her photograph album. She walked him to her gate just as Miss Marple would accompany the local vicar to hers. He kissed her cheek as he said, I'll be back soon. I promise. I love you. You're a good boy to me, Elton. Be safe. And she stood there, waving at him until he couldn't see her any more. One thought occupied his mind all the way home. May baskets. Stay tuned for tomorrow.